Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Let's drift back into the sleepy rhythm of medieval life. The village is quiet again, with its soft morning air and the low hum of distant activity that seems almost afraid to wake anyone too quickly. People step outside their homes one by one, stretching their arms in the pale sunlight and glancing at each other with that familiar medieval mixture of curiosity and mild suspicion. Another day of quietly monitoring one another's behavior is about to begin, and the expectations of the time remain as rigid as ever. Our slow journey continues from where we left off, wandering deeper into this interior world of beliefs, misunderstandings, and quiet judgment. We begin today with a gentle look at medieval attitudes toward creativity. Creativity was tolerated in limited forms: storytelling, painting religious icons, carving wooden objects, singing familiar songs. But creativity that wandered away from the ordinary was cause for concern. Someone who painted unusual scenes, like landscapes with oddly shaped hills or animals, wearing expressions that seemed to human might be suspected of letting their imaginations stretch too far. Creativity, in the medieval mind, was like a rope, helpful if kept at a safe length, dangerous if allowed to spool out indefinitely. Even harmless imaginative play could raise eyebrows. If a child played with sticks and stones in a way adults considered too inventive, some would worry that the child's mind was overly wild. Adults who indulged in imaginative thought were watched even more closely. A grown person daydreaming in public, tracing shapes in dust, or imagining stories was seen as not entirely grounded. Let's drift gently toward the medieval view of smell once again. Medieval people believed strongly in the influence of scent on the mind. Some households burned herbs to keep spirits at bay. Others kept small aromatic pouches for personal stability. But a person who enjoyed strong scents too much pressing herbs close to their face or lingering in scented corners of the market was often considered whimsical or unbalanced. Enjoying scent was fine. Enjoying it too visibly, that was another matter. Now let's move softly into the world of childlike behaviors. Being playful as an adult was frowned upon. Someone who skipped slightly while walking, hummed a cheerful tune at the wrong moment, or got too excited about small things might be labeled immature. Immaturity was tied to instability. Adults were expected to move slowly, speak calmly, and maintain an air of gentle seriousness. Anything that disrupted this calm facade became suspicious. Let's settle into the medieval interpretation of personal grooming again. Brushing one's hair too often was seen as vain. Brushing it too infrequently was seen as neglectful. A person who fiddled with their hair absent-mindedly might be accused of distraction or internal worry. Medieval people had an impressive ability to read meaning into absolutely anything, especially hair dot. And then there was the matter of posture while sitting. Sitting cross-legged was sometimes seen as undignified. Sitting with arms wrapped around the knees might be interpreted as brooding. Leaning back to far implied carelessness, and leaning forward to intently suggested agitation. Everything had symbolic meaning, even if most people had no idea what the symbols were supposed to mean. Now let's drift into another small area: reactions to silence. Medieval life was naturally quiet, filled with the gentle sounds of nature and labor. But unnatural silence when someone suddenly went quiet was noteworthy. If a person stopped speaking mid-conversation and stared into space for a moment, others might worry. If someone paused too long before responding, it was said that they were thinking too deeply, which was rarely considered good. Deep thinking belonged to scholars, monks, and people who were expected to handle that kind of mental strain. Ordinary villagers were encouraged to think simply, practically, and without too much wandering. Let's glide gently toward the medieval relationship with luck and coincidence. If someone had too many coincidences happen around them, finding things others lost, showing up at the exact moment something occurred, being in the right place, too often villagers might grow uneasy. Medieval people believed in patterns. Too many unusual patterns implied supernatural influence, and supernatural influence implied danger. A person who experienced repeated coincidences might be suspected of sorcery or, more mildly, of having an unquiet mind. Even clumsiness carried meaning. Someone who tripped often might be described as unbalanced within. Frequent dropping of objects was a sign that the mind was not coordinating properly with the body. The humors, they said, must be misaligned. Medieval medicine often attributed coordination issues to an internal coldness that slowed the flow of thought. Warming herbs were prescribed, though it's unclear whether the herbs helped or simply distracted people with their flavor. We move now into the medieval relationship with fire. Fire was central to life: cooking, warmth, light, safety. But fire also held symbolic power. Someone who enjoyed staring at it too much was thought to be lost in the flame. Someone who avoided fire and sat far away from it might be seen as fearful or spiritually fragile. Fire was supposed to be respected, but not admired. Warmth was supposed to be appreciated, but not longed for. These distinctions were vague but important. Let's drift toward medieval expectations around emotional control. A person who showed emotion too readily was assumed to be overwhelmed. Tears, unless tied to grief or religious devotion, were viewed with suspicion. Sudden joy was equally concerning. Medieval people valued emotional steadiness, the kind of quiet, even tone that rarely budged from its middle state. Being too cheerful, too sad, too excited, or too anxious was interpreted as instability. Most people hid their emotions because it was easier than explaining them. Now let's move softly toward the medieval idea of wandering alone, especially in nature. Walking alone into the woods or fields without any clear purpose was often seen as a sign of internal trouble. Nature was beautiful but unpredictable, and wandering alone implied a desire to escape or to commune with forces best left alone. A person who walked alone early in the morning or late at night was considered even more suspicious. Why go outside at such times unless the mind was restless? It didn't matter if someone simply enjoyed fresh air. People assumed there was more to it. Let's drift to the medieval understanding of personal attachment. Attaching too strongly to a pet, a family member, a friend, or even an object was seen as a weakness. People believed attachments made the mind vulnerable. If someone mourned too long after a loss, villagers whispered that the person had crossed into melancholy. Grief was supposed to fade in a timely, measured way. If it didn't, healers might be consulted to restore balance through herbs, rituals, or prayer. Even expressing affection could be suspicious. Too much affection suggested instability. Too little affection suggested coldness. The medieval world treated emotion like a delicate wooden boleusful, but easy to break if mishandled. Let's wander now into dining habits again. People watched how others used their utensils, or whatever resembled utensils. A person who cut food too precisely was deemed overly cautious. Someone who tore bread too forcefully was described as impulsive. Eating without speaking was suspicious. Speaking too much while eating was also suspicious. And eating while smiling alone was almost guaranteed to make someone uncomfortable. Let's drift toward medieval interpretations of personal orderliness. Someone who kept their space too tidy might be viewed as obsessive. Someone who kept it too cluttered might be seen as chaotic. A perfectly organized home raised eyebrows because perfection made people uneasy. Clutter was acceptable to a point, as long as it didn't hint at mental fog. The ideal home was gently tidy, but not obviously curated. Now let's move softly toward the medieval relationship with time. Medieval people didn't have modern clocks, but they had rhythms meals, prayer bells, sunlight, shadows. Someone who was consistently early was viewed as overly eager or anxious. Someone who was consistently late might be called absent-minded or undisciplined. Arriving early and leaving early suggested restlessness. Arriving late and leaving late suggested distraction. Once again, the safest place was the middle. Let's drift into medieval notions of excessive solitude. Spending time alone was normal for certain roles, hermits, shepherds, monks. But for ordinary villagers, too much solitude suggested inward spiraling. If someone preferred to sit alone by the river, people wondered what emotions were swirling inside. If they preferred solitary work, like repairing tools or weaving baskets away from the group, they risked being labeled as emotionally distant. Let's move toward the medieval fascination with dreams again. Sharing too many details from dreams made people uneasy. Dreamers were expected to keep their dreams modest, just a few lines, not entire stories. Someone who remembered dreams vividly was considered spiritually sensitive, which could be positive or negative. Someone who never remembered dreams might be considered spiritually blocked. The ideal, once again, sat unimpressively in the middle. We drift now into personal habits that seemed insignificant but weren't. Tapping fingers on the table was suspicious. Twisting clothing was suspicious. Cracking knuckles, though perhaps uncommon, might be labeled as a sign of agitation. Staring at water reflections too long could be interpreted as vanity or introspection gone too far. Even whistling by oneself could be viewed as strange. Music was supposed to be shared. Let's step lightly toward the medieval attitude toward generosity. Giving too much was suspicious. It suggested impulsiveness or a desire to gain favor. Giving too little suggested stinginess, which was tied to internal coldness. People monitored each other's generosity closely, convinced it reflected the mind's temperature. Finally, we glide toward the underlying truth yet again. Medieval people lived in a world where nearly every behavior was a clue, a possible indicator of imbalance. Their worldview demanded constant vigilance. They believed the mind was fragile, always shifting, always at risk of tipping into states beyond control. And so they watched. They interpreted. They worried. They reassured themselves with rituals and herbs and theories that their world made sense. Let's drift back into the slow, familiar rhythm of medieval life. The afternoon sun hangs low, softened by a thin haze that makes the entire village look a little sleepy. People move about their routines with the same cautious steadiness as always, sweeping doorways, tending fires, carrying baskets, and glancing very discreetly, of course, at whatever their neighbors are doing. Every day seems to offer a fresh opportunity to evaluate someone's mental state. even if no one would ever admit that's what they're doing. We pick up our long, quiet journey right where we left off, easing deeper into the kinds of everyday behaviors that medieval people interpreted through a surprisingly narrow lens. One of the most curious beliefs involved the idea of stillness. Not the normal kind of stillness that comes when a person pauses to rest, but extended stillness, like sitting perfectly motionless for a few minutes. Medieval villagers didn't trust long stillness. If someone sat too quietly, they wondered whether thoughts were drifting too far inward. After all, the mind was supposed to stay lightly tethered to daily tasks. Any sign of deep inward movement, such as staring at a wall for a bit too long, raised mild concern. Someone might gently call the person's name, simply to make sure they hadn't slipped into a private world. Let's drift into another area: the medieval suspicion of unpredictability. If a person who was typically talkative suddenly became quiet, others noticed. If someone who was usually calm suddenly became energetic, people whispered. Medieval villagers believed the mind should behave like the seasons, changing slowly, predictably, and with enough warning that everyone could adjust. Sudden behavioral changes were seen as a sign of internal disturbance, even if the reason was nothing more than being tired or bored. Another small but important detail involved the way people handled tools. If someone held tools carelessly, it suggested impulsiveness. If they held tools too precisely, it suggested rigidity. Even sharpening tools too often could raise questions about a person's temperament. Why sharpen a knife more times than necessary? Did the person enjoy the sound a bit too much? Did the rhythm of sharpening soothe them in ways others didn't understand? People rarely said anything directly, but quiet judgments formed quickly. Let's drift gently into medieval thoughts on weather sensitivity again. People noticed if someone seemed too strongly affected by changes in temperature. Someone who shivered at mild cold might be considered physically and mentally delicate. Someone who didn't react to cold at all might be considered overly hardened or emotionally numb. Enjoying the heat too much was odd. Disliking it too strongly was also odd. The ideal was a neutral response: mild appreciation, mild discomfort. Nothing too pronounced. Now we move softly toward attitudes about personal reflection. Medieval villagers did not spend much time looking at their reflections. Mirrors were rare and often expensive. Water reflections were distorted. A person who paused too long by a still pond to gaze at their own face could seem overly absorbed in themselves. Self-reflection, in both literal and metaphorical sense, wasn't encouraged. Too much inward thinking suggested instability. People were expected to focus outward on chores, on community, on prayer, on anything except the labyrinth inside their own heads. Let's drift into the medieval fear of unusual sleep patterns. Waking up far earlier than others without reason was suspicious. Staying awake too late, especially if the person wandered quietly in the house or yard, created unease. A person awake during the wrong hours might be thought of as touched by strange thoughts or disturbed humor balances. Medieval people associated nighttime with spiritual danger. Being awake when others slept implied vulnerability to invisible forces. Even simply enjoying the moonlight could raise questions. Let's wander toward the world of social gatherings. People were expected to behave in predictable ways during feasts or community events. Someone who stayed on the edges, observing quietly, might be interpreted as aloof or troubled. Someone who joined too enthusiastically might be seen as excitable. A person who changed their mood, mid-gathering, laughing one moment, then withdrawing the next, was watched particularly closely. They might be offered extra food or encouraged to sit near the fire. Subtle attempts to restore their balance. People meant well, even if their logic was questionable. Now, let's move gently toward the medieval interpretation of odors from the body. Someone who smelled too strongly of sweat might be labeled overheated in mind and body. Someone who smelled too neutral, almost no scent at all, might be viewed as cold or drained of vitality. People even interpreted the smell of someone's breath. Sour breath suggested melancholy. Sweet breath suggested heat. Their theories were not scientifically sound, but they were widely believed. Let's drift to another small category: gestures of worry. Fidgeting with clothing, rubbing one's forehead, touching the fingertips together, or tapping lightly on tables were all seen as signals of internal discomfort. Even thoughtful gestures, like resting one's chin in the hand, could be misinterpreted. A person who made too many of these movements throughout the day was often described as heavy of thought, which wasn't a compliment. Heavy thoughts were feared. They meant the mind might be carrying burdens that no one could see. Let's move softly toward medieval beliefs about emotional repetition. If someone expressed the same emotion repeatedly, anger, sadness, enthusiasm, others worried that the emotion might have taken root. They believed emotions could become lodged inside the body. For example, repeated sadness might sink into the liver. Repeated anger might lodge in the heart. Repeated laughter might fill the head with heat. These ideas made people cautious about expressing their feelings too often. Better to remain mildly pleasant and mildly neutral, just to avoid speculation. Now, let's drift into how medieval people interpreted unusual preferences. Preferring to sit near a window was suspicious if done too frequently. Preferring corners was also suspicious. Preferring open spaces was, predictably, suspicious too. The idea of preference itself could be worrying. They expected people to simply use whatever space was available without developing attachments. Attachments suggested emotional leaning, and emotional leaning suggested imbalance. Let's wander toward another subtle belief: the pace of eating and drinking. Someone who took very small bites might be considered overly delicate. Someone who took large bites might be deemed impulsive. Drinking slowly suggested melancholy. Drinking too quickly suggested heat. Someone who paused often while eating might be lost in thought. Someone who didn't pause at all might be too absorbed in hunger. In a world with few certainties, meal behavior became one of many tiny things to observe. Now we move gently toward the medieval understanding of voice tone. People with naturally soft voices were sometimes thought to be hiding internal weakness. People with naturally loud voices might be labeled as lacking self-control. A person whose voice changed depending on the situation was observed even more closely. Changing tone too quickly suggested instability. Keeping the same tone all the time suggested emotional flatness. The ideal tone was calm, mid-level, measured, a vocal version of the humor's idea. Let's drift into the medieval suspicion of excessive knowledge. Someone who remembered too many details, especially about plants, stars, or faraway places, might be considered dangerously curious. Some villagers admired intelligence, but only in a cautious, limited way. A person who seemed too knowledgeable became a walking question mark. Did they read too much? Did they think too much? Did the mind's warmth make it overactive? Medieval explanations often circled these kinds of questions. Let's move to another behavior: being overly observant. If someone noticed patterns, others didn't like the shape of certain leaves, the arrangement of stones in the path. or the way the wind blew on specific days, they might be suspected of having a mind that wandered into unnecessary details. Too much perception was dangerous. It meant the mind wasn't staying grounded in the essential tasks of life. Let's drift gently into the way medieval people interpreted physical touch. A person who disliked touch could be considered cold or troubled. A person who sought touch, such as hugging or touching arms during conversation, could be considered overly emotional. People expected a moderate level of interaction. Too much or too little was seen as an imbalance. Now let's wander toward the medieval understanding of quiet hobbies. Activities like carving wood, weaving patterns, sorting objects, or tending small fires were fine in moderation. But if someone became too absorbed losing track of time or failing to respond when spoken to, others might worry the person was retreating into an internal maze. Medieval villagers valued productivity but distrusted deep focusing, which they believed could cause the soul to drift. We return to the larger truth that medieval people lived with constant awareness of the fragile boundary between normal behavior and perceived instability. Their world was shaped by beliefs about humors, spirits, and unseen forces, beliefs that made them look for meaning in every gesture. And while their interpretations were often misguided, they stemmed from a desire to understand the complex human mind using the limited knowledge they had. Let's drift slowly back into the medieval world, where the daylight thins into a soft, hazy afternoon and the air carries the faint smell of wood smoke and damp earth. People move around their homes with unhurried steps, and the village feels wrapped in a blanket of calm repetition. It's the kind of place where you can hear the sound of bread crust cracking from across the courtyard, and where even the smallest gesture tends to draw someone's quiet attention. Everyone watches everyone, not in a hostile way, but in that mild, constant curiosity that medieval villagers considered practical. After all, the mind was fragile, and the signs of its fragility might appear anywhere. We pick up the story once again, letting each idea settle softly before drifting forward. Today we begin with the medieval suspicion of possession by silence. Not in the supernatural sense, though that was always an option, but in the behavioral one. Long stretches of silence in a person's day were considered unusual unless the person was praying or explicitly resting. If someone sat silently without a clear purpose, their neighbors wondered whether they were lost in brooding thoughts. Too much silence made people uneasy. They believed silence allowed thoughts to wander too far, perhaps into unhealthy territory. People would sometimes cough gently or shuffle their feet near a quiet person, hoping to pull them back into the world. Now let's move softly into the medieval interpretations of facial stillness. A face that did not change expressions much could be read as cold, troubled, or spiritually blocked. People expected small emotional signals, smiles, faint frowns, raised eyebrows. A face that sat in the same neutral shape to consistently worried them. They thought it meant the mind was stagnant or weighed down by internal fog. Ironically, too many expressions were equally concerning. Someone who reacted too visibly to everything, laughing loudly, frowning deeply, or widening their eyes, often might be thought unstable. As usual, the comfortable, moderate middle was the ideal, though the village rarely agreed on where that middle actually was. Let's drift toward the medieval view of body temperature. People believed that the warmth or coolness of a person's skin revealed their mental state. A person who seemed unusually warm to the touch might be judged excitable or overheated in temperament. Someone who felt too cold might be described as melancholy. Even the warmth of someone's hands became a quiet subject of interpretation. If someone's hands felt cold every day, villagers wondered if sadness was sinking deeper into their body. The idea wasn't scientifically accurate, but it shaped daily interactions in subtle ways. Let's move gently to the subject of walking paths. Medieval villagers tended to walk the same few routes every day between home, fields, markets, and the church. A person who chose unfamiliar paths too often might be seen as wandering, both literally and mentally. Wandering in the physical sense wasn't a problem by itself, but wandering without reason was suspicious. If someone explored back lanes or walked around the outskirts of the village repeatedly, others wondered what thoughts were guiding them. The mind, they believed, could drift along with one's footsteps. Now let's drift into the medieval suspicion of small personal rituals. Many people had tiny habit-stepping fingers, touching the edges of objects, murmuring short phrases before a task. These habits were tolerated if they stayed subtle. But if a ritual became noticeable, villagers started to whisper. They might assume the person was trying to ward off something invisible. Rituals were associated with superstition, and superstition was associated with an unsteady mind. Even innocent habits, like double-knotting a belt every time, could be interpreted as unnecessary obsession. Let's move softly toward the medieval view of light sensitivity. Someone who disliked bright sunlight might be described as having weak spirits or tender thoughts. Someone who avoided darkness too firmly might be thought fearful to an unhealthy degree, and someone who embraced darkness, choosing dim corners, shaded rooms, or candlelight more often than needed was especially suspicious. Loving darkness suggested melancholy or an affinity with the unseen. Villagers preferred natural light and moderate shadows. Anything more extreme made people uncomfortable. We drift now into tidiness, expectations again. Orderliness was valued, but not too much of it. A person whose belongings were arranged too neatly might be thought obsessive. A person who insisted on exact placement, shoes aligned perfectly, tools arranged by size, herbs sorted by shade of green, could be labeled as overly controlled. Medieval people admired order but distrusted perfection. They thought a perfect home meant the mind had tightened itself too much, squeezing out spontaneity. On the other hand, too much disorder suggested laziness or emotional heaviness. The ideal was comfortable machines, which most people naturally achieved. Let's wander toward the medieval suspicion of long pauses. Someone who paused too long before answering a question might be accused of hiding something or overthinking. Thinking was expected, but only in gentle, manageable amounts. Deliberation was fine, as long as it didn't last so long that silence settled uncomfortably in the room. People didn't like empty spaces in conversation. They preferred a steady flow of small remarks, even if half of them were about weather or livestock. Long thinking gaps created tension, and tension invited interpretation. Now let's move to emotional consistency. Medieval villagers expected people to maintain familiar emotional patterns. If someone who was usually cheerful turned quiet for a day, villagers noticed. If someone who was usually serious appeared suddenly light-hearted, they noticed that too. Behavioral shifts, no matter how temporary, sparked curiosity about potential internal imbalances. Even a single different mood could cause someone to quietly wonder whether the person had slept poorly or eaten the wrong food, or been influenced by unpleasant thoughts. In a world where emotions were tied to humors, every shift raised the question of what was happening inside the body. Let's drift toward the medieval view of restlessness. If someone stood and sat repeatedly, paced without clear purpose, or shifted their weight often, villagers suspected agitation. Restlessness suggested heat, and heat was associated with impatience or anxiety. People were often advised to drink cool herbal infusions or rest beside a shaded window. Quiet rest was seen as the cure for many things, even though not everyone liked sitting still. Unfortunately for them, stillness carried its own set of suspicions, so there was no winning. Now, let's move into the medieval suspicion of overly tidy speech. People who spoke very carefully, choosing every word, were sometimes labeled as overly self-conscious. Too much language precision suggested that the mind was burdened or overly focused on its own mechanics. Meanwhile, sloppy or rushed speech suggested disorganization or agitation. Speech was expected to be steady, simple, and practical. A person who spoke in metaphors or colorful descriptions risked being called fanciful, which was not always a compliment. Imagination needed tight boundaries. Let's drift gently toward interest in stories. Medieval villagers enjoyed stories, but only in modest amounts. A person who asked for too many stories or retold them too passionately might be thought overly imaginative. Someone who remembered too many details from old tales could be judged for having a mind that clung too tightly to irrelevant things. Even laughter during storytelling was expected to remain soft and polite. Stories were meant to pass time, not awaken emotions too deeply. Let's move softly into the world of task switching. Medieval people were used to finishing one task before beginning another. A person who jumped between tasks, starting one chore, then switching suddenly to another, might be seen as unfocused. If someone left tasks half done regularly, it suggested their thoughts couldn't settle. People preferred consistent work rhythms, and anyone who disrupted those rhythms made others quietly uncomfortable. Now let's drift toward gaze behaviors again. Eyes revealed much in medieval thinking. A gaze that flicked around the room too often implied worry or distraction. A gaze that stayed fixed too long suggested inward drifting. Someone who rarely made eye contact might be considered secretive. Someone who maintained eye contact too firmly might be considered intense. Even blinking patterns were sometimes noticed. The more villagers paid attention, the more possible meanings they found. Let's wander toward the medieval understanding of reaction to beauty. If someone admired sunsets too earnestly or paused too long to observe a flower, others might interpret it as excessive sensitivity. Beauty was appreciated, but quietly. Too much admiration felt impractical. Practicality was prized. So while nature was pleasant, becoming visibly moved by nature was a risk. Now let's drift into the medieval view of excitement. Excitement wasn't encouraged beyond mild enthusiasm. A person who seemed eager clapping, smiling widely, talking quickly could be seen as overheated. Too much excitement was believed to scatter thoughts. Even positive emotions were treated carefully. People believed joy could overflow its boundaries and cause the mind to wobble. Let's move softly toward fear responses. Someone who jumped at small noises was thought delicate. Someone who remained calm during big noises, like a slamming door, was thought overly hardened. Emotional reflexes were supposed to fall in a particular unwritten pattern that villagers instinctively expected but rarely described. We drift now into unusual hobbies. Activities like carving shapes into wood for fun, collecting feathers, or watching birds too closely were all seen as signs of excessive internal wandering. Hobbies were supposed to be practical. Anything that leaned too far into personal enjoyment was questioned. Let's wander into the medieval suspicion of private conversations. If someone spoke to themselves, Quietly muttering under their breath, they attracted suspicion quickly. Self-talk was seen as a sign that thoughts were misbehaving. Even humming alone could raise questions. Medieval life was communal, and people were expected to keep their inner world tucked away. Now we drift gently toward reaction to illness in others. A person who seemed overly concerned when someone fell sick was considered overly sensitive. Someone who wasn't concerned enough was considered emotionally cold. Responses had to be balanced: concerned but not dramatic, calm but not dismissive. People walked emotional tightropes for social acceptance. We return once again to the soft, overarching truth. Medieval people lived inside a tightly woven web of expectations. Every gesture, every mood, every pause had meaning. They believed the mind was always shifting, like a feather in the wind. And the only way to understand it was through constant, quiet observation. Their world was simple in tools, but complicated in interpretations. And in the flickering light of their homes, they tried their best to make sense of one another. Let's drift back into the soft, predictable rhythm of the medieval day. The sun has started its slow descent, casting a warm, muted glow across the village rooftops. Shadows stretch gently along the ground, moving at the same unhurried pace as the people who pass over them. There's a mild chill in the air now, the kind that encourages villagers to finish their tasks early and settle in before nightfall. And as always, people watch each other with that quiet vigilance the medieval world considered perfectly normal. Every gesture, every pause, every tiny preference still feels like it carries a hidden meaning. We return to our long, sleepy journey through their beliefs, letting the next layer of misunderstandings unfold softly. We begin this part with the medieval suspicion of intense focus. Concentration was a useful skill, of course, especially for craftspeople or scholars. But prolonged focus, someone staring too long at a piece of wood they were carving, or getting lost in a weaving pattern, could make others uneasy. The idea of being absorbed was troubling. People believed too much absorption meant the mind wasn't staying anchored. A carpenter who forgot to respond when spoken to might be nudged back gently, as if being rescued from drifting too far into thought. Let's drift gently toward the medieval understanding of personal pacing. We've touched on walking speed before, but pacing indoors was equally suspicious. If someone walked back and forth in a small space, others wondered what internal conflict was pushing them. Pacing suggested agitation, or worse, indecision. Medieval people did not like indecision. They believed a healthy mind made quick, practical choices. So anyone unable to settle physically was quietly marked as unsettled mentally. Now let's move softly to the medieval fear of constant tidying. Tidying excessively wasn't encouraged. Cleaning a small corner repeatedly or adjusting objects again and again suggested fixation. Fixation was associated with rigidity of mind. People believed the humors could become stuck, and repetitive actions were interpreted as proof. So a person who swept one patch of floor several times might hear someone gently suggest taking a break, as though too much cleanliness might cause emotional instability. Let's drift into the medieval suspicion surrounding interest in distant places. Most villagers lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. A person expressing curiosity about faraway lands, asking many questions about distant cities, or wanting to travel without a clear reason was considered odd. Too much longing for the unknown suggested the mind was restless. They believed such curiosity could pull the soul away from stability. Even stories about faraway places were considered mildly dangerous if enjoyed too much. Now we move to another small corner, thoughtful pauses. Medieval villagers preferred practical conversation. A person who paused too often, thinking deeply before responding, was sometimes seen as overly introspective. And introspection, while not forbidden, was viewed with caution. Anything that resembled diving inward suggested a person might get stuck inside their own thoughts. Villagers often encouraged each other to keep words simple, answers brief, and thinking light. Let's drift softly toward the idea of physical sensitivity. Someone who reacted strongly to textures grimacing at rough wool, running fingers repeatedly along smooth wood, or avoiding certain materials might be seen as overly delicate. Medieval people expected everyone to tolerate discomfort. A person who showed too much sensitivity, whether to texture or temperature or sound, was subtly judged. They believed internal imbalance made the senses unpredictable, so too much reaction to anything was suspicious. Now let's move to color preference. Villagers wore practical colors: brown, gray, muted greens. Someone who consistently preferred one color to strongly even something harmless, like blue, might be considered emotionally attached in an unusual way. Someone who disliked all colors except one might be seen as overly rigid or obsessive. And someone who loved too many colors too loudly risked being labeled whimsical or unstable. Even fashion choices became a quiet psychology lesson. Let's drift into the medieval approach to body language during conversation. People expected others to stand still, face the speaker gently, and keep gestures minimal. Someone who shifted their weight constantly or looked around too much was suspected of distraction. Someone who held their arms too tightly across their chest might be seen as hiding sorrow. Someone who spoke with hands moving too freely appeared impulsive. A healthy conversation was supposed to feel balanced, still, and mild. Let's wander toward the medieval fear of sudden laughter. We've talked about solo laughter, but sudden laughter in general was considered strange. A person who laughed quickly or unexpectedly even at something genuinely funny was sometimes judged as having loose emotional boundaries. People preferred slow, soft laughter that seemed to warm the room rather than disrupt it. Quick bursts felt unpredictable, and unpredictability was unsettling. Now let's move to the medieval suspicion of napping. Napping too often during the day was seen as laziness, of course, but also as a sign of melancholy. People thought the body's humors grew heavy with sadness and pulled a person into sleep. A person who napped too frequently might be encouraged to drink warm herbal mixtures or to spend more time in the sun. On the other hand, someone who refused to nap even when tired might be described as restless or frightened of their own dreams. Sleep, paradoxically, needed balance. Let's drift into preoccupation with minor injuries. A person who fussed too much over small cuts or bruises might be judged as overly worried. Medieval villagers expected people to endure discomfort quietly. Too much concern suggested a fragile mind. Too little concerns, someone ignoring pain entirely, was also suspicious. They believed the mind and body should react in proportion to each other. Anything else was an imbalance. Now let's move to the medieval approach to storytelling habits. If someone told stories too frequently, remembering every detail with enthusiasm, villagers might see them as overly imaginative. If someone refused to tell stories at all, they might be labeled dull or emotionally closed. Storytelling was supposed to be occasional, quiet, and mostly practical. Excessive creativity risked pulling the mind into fantasy. Let's drift toward the medieval suspicion of collecting habits. Collecting object stones, feathers, carved bits of wood was rare. A person who collected too many things was considered sentimental or unfocused. A person who collected unusual things, like dried insects or oddly shaped sticks, was considered even stranger. Collecting meant noticing details that others ignored, and that alone was suspicious. Now we move softly to the medieval expectations surrounding work posture. People believed the way someone worked revealed their internal state. A person who leaned too close to their work suggested intensity bordering on obsession. Someone who kept too much distance from their work implied detachment. Even the rhythm of hammering, weaving, or stirring a pot was watched. Rhythms to fast implied haste. Rhythms to slow implied sadness. Let's drift into the medieval suspicion of excessive gratitude. Saying thank you too often made people uncomfortable. Gratitude was appreciated, but not in abundance. Too much gratitude suggested insecurity. Too little gratitude suggested coldness. The ideal was acknowledging kindness mildly, then moving on. Now, let's move to nighttime behavior. If someone walked outside at night for any reason unrelated to emergencies or livestock, villagers grew uneasy. Night wandering was heavily associated with melancholy or spiritual vulnerability. Even sitting outside under the moonlight, enjoying its glow, could be misinterpreted as longing for solitude in an unhealthy way. The medieval night was not a place for reflection. It was a place for sleep. Let's drift gently toward fascination with animals. A person who watched animals too much, especially wild animals, might be thought of as strange. Observing bird behavior or studying insect movements suggested a wandering mind. People admired animals, but only in a practical way. Any hint of emotional or intellectual fascination made villagers uneasy. We drift now into emotional mismatch with someone who seemed cheerful during somber moments or calm during stressful ones was seen as mentally misaligned. Emotions were supposed to follow the group rhythm. Being out of sync implied internal disturbance. Let's move softly toward excessive compliments. Complimenting too often was suspicious. People thought it meant the person was trying to hide something. Compliments were rare and usually practical: good harvest, strong ox, warm bread. Anything more personal felt uncomfortably intimate. Let's drift into the medieval suspicion of private smiles. A person who smiled to themselves without obvious reason might attract quiet stares. A private smile meant private thoughts, and private thoughts were dangerous in a communal world. We return again to the truth. Running through all these observations, medieval people lived with a deep belief that the mind could stray at any moment. So they watched, interpreted, guessed, and sometimes judged. Their world was built on routine and repetition, and anything outside that rhythm felt unsafe. Even normal modern behaviors looked suspicious through their lens. Let's drift one last time into this quiet medieval world. Evening has settled over the village with a slow, velvety calm. A few lanterns flicker in doorways, their soft glow stretching across uneven stone paths. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys. The sounds of the day have faded into a gentle hush. It's the hour when people settle into their routines, speaking softly, thinking softly, and watching softly. The medieval world always seemed to watch itself, even when nothing was happening, and in its steady, cautious way, it believed that the smallest behaviors could reveal deep truths about the state of a person's mind. We drift now into the final stretch of this long, slow journey, one more quiet look at the everyday habits medieval people interpreted, misinterpreted, or simply feared. We begin with the medieval suspicion of lingering in thought. People were expected to shake off thoughts quickly. Thinking was a tool, not a destination. So if someone sat with their chin resting on their fist for too long, or stared thoughtfully into a cup of ale, villagers assumed something was troubling them. Long thoughts were dangerous because they left room for melancholy, fantasy, or spiritual confusion. Even the simple act of staring at the horizon was treated with caution. The horizon might be beautiful, but beauty was not supposed to consume the mind. Let's drift toward another concern: sudden bursts of productivity. If someone woke early one morning and worked with unusual enthusiasm, villagers worried. Excess energy could indicate heat in the blood or an oncoming frenzy. Productivity was admirable, but only in a steady, predictable form. Sudden effort made people wonder if the person was trying to outrun their own emotions. Now let's move softly into the medieval suspicion of overly coordinated movements. Someone who moved to smoothly picking up tools with graceful ease, turning corners without hesitation, walking with unusual nimbleness, might be seen as unnatural. Perfect coordination was associated with performers, monks, or soldiers, but among ordinary villagers it created unease. Medieval people were used to roughness and hesitation. Too much grace suggested something excessive, like the mind was tuned too tightly. Let's drift gently into the idea of being hard to read. Ambiguity made medieval people uncomfortable. If someone reacted calmly to bad news, but also calmly to good news, others wondered whether the person felt anything at all. Emotional neutrality was good, but not constant. People wanted to see small signals, soft smiles, faint frowns. A person who remained unreadable was believed to have closed humors, a phrase used to describe people who kept their emotions hidden even from themselves. Now let's move toward the medieval suspicion of slow speaking. Speaking slowly could suggest caution, but too slow or too deliberate was concerning. Villagers feared it meant the person was thinking too deeply or struggling to organize their thoughts. The mind, they believed, should flow like a quiet stream, not a clogged one. They sometimes encouraged slow speakers to drink spiced broth to warm the mind, as though words were held back by coldness. Let's drift into overly deep sleep. People who slept so deeply they didn't wake during normal disturbances were watched carefully. Deep sleep suggested vulnerability or spiritual heaviness. A person who missed early church bells or slept through a storm might be suspected of an imbalance. On the other hand, someone who woke too easily, startled by small noises, was thought emotionally fragile. The perfect sleep was somewhere in between a gentle, moderate drifting. Now let's move softly toward the medieval view of discomfort during celebrations. Feasts and festivals were central to village life. A person who seemed anxious or aloof during celebrations might be viewed as emotionally distant. Someone who left early was suspicious. Someone who arrived late was also suspicious. People expected a kind of cheerful participation. Too much cheerfulness was concerning, and too little was equally so. Even the speed at which someone raised a cup of ale could be interpreted. Let's drift into the medieval suspicion of interest in symbolism. People who noticed hidden patterns, shapes, and clouds, meanings in dreams. Connections between events were viewed as teetering toward mysticism. Mysticism was respected in monks, but not in ordinary villagers. A miller who talked too poetically about the way wheat bent in the wind invited uneasy glances. Symbolic thinking suggested the mind was wandering into strange layers. Now let's move into another concern: preference for solitude in nature. Nature was respected but treated with caution. Woods, rivers, hills, they carried spiritual presence. Someone who deliberately sought solitude among them risked being seen as too introspective. Villagers preferred company. A person who walked alone for long stretches might be labeled as troubled or melancholy, especially if they didn't explain why. Just because wasn't a convincing reason in medieval logic. Let's drift toward unusual eating rhythms. Eating too slowly made people uneasy. Eating too quickly made them just as uneasy. Eating in silence was suspicious, and eating while humming was odd. Even enjoying food too much, closing the eyes while tasting bread or savoring herbs was interpreted as indulgent. Pleasure needed to be restrained. Too much pleasure suggested weakness. Now let's move softly toward variation in routine. We've touched on routines many times, but medieval villagers took them seriously. If someone suddenly changed the order in which they did morning chores, it raised quiet questions. Why sweep before fetching water? Why feed animals later than usual? Any small shift in pattern could spark speculation about the person's internal balance. Medieval life revolved around repetition, and anything that disrupted that rhythm made people uncomfortable. Let's drift gently into interest in unusual objects. If someone picked up a strange rock, studied it, and kept it, villagers wondered what significance they saw in it. A stone was just a stone, which created fear. Curiosity about unusual objects implied the mind was focusing too intensely on things with no practical purpose. Now, let's wander toward the medieval suspicion of watching fires too long. Fire was mesmerizing, so people naturally stared at it. But too much staring seemed ominous. Villagers believed flame could stir the imagination, and imagination could stir the humors. Someone who sat in front of a fire, unmoving, lost in the flickering light, might be gently nudged away. A person needed to stay connected to the world, not slip into the glow of flames. Let's move now into the medieval concern about emotional withdrawal. Emotional distance, even temporary, was noticed. A person who didn't smile at a joke or who seemed uninterested in others' news was quietly watched. People feared that emotional withdrawal was the beginning of melancholy. Melancholy was one of the most feared states because it could deepen into sadness that lingered endlessly. Let's drift into the medieval suspicion of swift emotional recovery. If someone recovered too quickly from a disappointment or loss, others wondered if they had felt anything at all. Emotional resilience wasn't fully trusted. It seemed unnatural to bounce back quickly. People expected sadness to last long enough to be seen by the community, and recovery to arrive gently. Now, let's move toward excessive curiosity about the mind. A person who asked too many questions about thoughts, feelings, or dreams might be seen as meddling in dangerous territory. Medieval villagers expected people to accept their emotions without dissecting them. Trying to understand the mind too deeply could lead to confusion, or so they believed. Introspection was not considered healthy unless done within narrow boundaries. Let's drift into interest in personal meaning. Someone who pondered their purpose, their path in life, or their role in the world might be labeled as melancholic. Medieval people valued practicality. Purpose was simple: survive, work, pray, repeat. Too much questioning meant the mind was wrestling with itself. Now let's move softly into the medieval view of graceful sadness. Someone who carried themselves calmly while clearly sad caused unease. Sadness was expected to look heavy, slouched shoulders, quiet sighs. If someone seemed composed in sadness, Villagers didn't know how to interpret it. Calm sorrow didn't fit into their emotional categories. They preferred sorrow that was visible. Let's drift into unexpected joys. A person who found joy in small things like dew on grass or the sound of birds at dawn might be seen as whimsical. Joy needed to come from appropriate sources: feasts, good harvests, births. Too much joy from nature or solitude suggested the mind wandered into places regular villagers didn't explore. Finally, as we gently close this long journey, we return to the heart of medieval thinking. The mind was always believed to be on the verge of imbalance. Any behavior too much, too little, too sudden, too still might point to instability. Medieval villagers lived inside a world shaped by fear, routine, superstition, and an earnest desire to protect their community. They didn't understand the brain, so they watched everything else instead. And through this long, quiet story, we've wandered with them through behaviors, glances, pauses, worries, and routines, seeing how ordinary actions were once interpreted through candlelit logic.